Awesome. So this week, what we're going to do is really dive into step 3 of the adaptation workbook process. So this is where we're really starting to think about, we've gone through and defined our goals and objectives. We've thought about some of our climate impacts and vulnerabilities. And now what we want to do this week is really start to think about what are some of those different challenges and opportunities that climate change presents to achieving our management goals and objectives. So this step is really important because it's that gut check for us to really think about how are we achieving our goals and objectives, and are they still feasible given all of the climate change information that we've gathered in the last couple of weeks. And so as a friendly reminder, this adaptation planning and practices training is led by a series and team of experienced instructors specializing in climate adaptation. And so if you have questions throughout any point in the course or the training, please reach out to any of us and we're happy to help and answer any questions you may have. Today, the content is being provided by myself, Courtney Peterson, and Luke Nave. All right, so again, a quick agenda for what we're going to cover today. We're going to dive into an introduction of step 3 of the adaptation workbook process, all the different questions and tips and tricks to consider for this step. Luke will provide an example of a project that's gone through this process and how they considered challenges and opportunities. And then we'll talk about the assignment and homework for when we come back together on April 17th. So quick reminder, next week is our break week. So there will not be a lecture on April 10th. We'll be back on April 17th. All right, so again, this week, we're really going to introduce step 3, which is evaluating those management objectives that you've all developed considering climate change. And so far through this process, we've really figured out where are we working, what do we value, what are our goals and objectives and management timeframes and our management topics. And in step 2, we've assessed those climate change impacts and vulnerabilities for our location and our project of interest, given the different resources that are available. So this week in step 3, what we really want to do is take all of that information from our goals and objectives and the climate change impacts we've identified to really think about how are we going to continue to achieve our goals and objectives given all of the different climate change challenges and opportunities that climate change presents, and really determine the feasibility of meeting our management goals and objectives under current management, or potentially business as usual management. And so a lot of times we can get step 2 and step 3 confused. They are pretty similar and you may think they're similar, but they're actually distinctly different. And so if we remember in step 2, what we're really doing is thinking about where are we working and the characteristics of our place. So we're really trying to describe what are those climate change impacts and vulnerabilities to a particular location or site, and how is climate change going to play out based on slope and aspect and topography and species composition and structure based on our current location. And step 3, what we're doing is we're really describing how climate change may affect meeting our management goals and objectives. So we're really taking a pause based on that climate information we got in step 2 and really evaluating, can we achieve our goals and objectives given the different climate challenges and opportunities that climate change presents. So again, these are similar steps. We're still thinking about climate change impacts, but they're different in the terms of thinking about location versus our goals and objectives for management. So the key questions we're really asking in this step are what management challenges or opportunities might occur under climate change? Can our current management meet our management goals and objectives? Or do our goals need to change based on the feasibility of being able to achieve our goals and objectives given current management? So to dive into this a little bit more, what you'll really do in step 3 is start to think about, again, those climate change challenges related to meeting your management objectives. So we can really start to think about what are some of those different ways that climate change impacts or vulnerabilities are going to make it more difficult to achieve each of your management objectives. So this is really where we can start to think about what are those things and considerations that are going to make it harder to achieve your management objective given those climate change impacts we researched in step 2. And in this step, it's really important that we focus on challenges that are within our control. We don't necessarily want to think about global markets or policies or funding. There is a place for those different considerations, but they'll be put in an additional consideration box. So really think about what are the climate challenges that are going to make it harder to achieve our management objectives in this step. So one example, a couple examples, we might have an objective where we want to provide sufficient protection and habitat for the eastern box turtle. So one challenge from climate change might be that it's going to be harder to maintain those habitats given drier conditions, fluctuating water levels, or reduced snowpack. So again, we're really thinking about what are those climate challenges that are going to make it harder to maintain that habitat for the eastern box turtle. Another example, we might have an objective of improving breeding habitat for forest interior birds by providing a variety of forest structures. A climate challenge for that management objective might be that there are projected declines in conifer species that are going to reduce the habitat component for those forest interior birds. And then finally, we might have an objective about increasing the tree canopy coverage, especially in under-canopied and under-resourced neighborhoods. And so one of the climate challenges is that the urban heat island effect is disproportionately impacting those under-canopied and under-resourced neighborhoods. So again, all of those things are making it harder to achieve our goals and objectives under climate change based on those climate challenges. The second thing we'll do in step 3 is really think about what are some of those different climate opportunities. So it's really easy to come up with a list of things that might make it harder to achieve our goals and objectives, but we really want to challenge you to think about what are some of those potential opportunities and silver linings and things that are actually going to make it easier to achieve our goals and objectives under climate change as well. And so again, in this step, really think about what are the ways in which climate change impacts and vulnerabilities will make it easier to achieve each management objective, or maybe there's new management opportunities that we can start to consider. And so some examples of opportunities for those 3 management objectives for providing habitat for the eastern box turtle. An opportunity from climate change might be that we might be able to improve habitat during management, such as maintaining and retaining woody residues on site. For improving that breeding habitat for forest interior birds, a climate opportunity might be that active management can really help us improve forest structure and create more of that heterogeneity and diversity in the canopy. And active management can also increase coarse woody material. And then finally, for the urban tree canopy coverage, 2 different climate opportunities may be that a warming climate may allow for a broader range of species to be introduced to the city's forest, really increasing that urban canopy diversity. And trees planted in residents' yards will likely have access to more soil moisture than street trees, especially during periods of less precipitation and drought. And so in this step, as we're thinking about those challenges and opportunities, we can really start to evaluate and weigh, do we have more challenges or do we have more opportunities? And how are the odds really stacked up against us or not, to evaluate the feasibility of achieving our goals and objectives? And so we can really start to think about, can feasibility be determined over both the short and the long term, given these different management challenges and opportunities from climate change? So our feasibility may be very high. Those opportunities are really outweighing those challenges. So we do want to move forward with our management objectives as they are, because we have more opportunities than challenges under climate change. Maybe the feasibility is moderate. There might be some challenges to meeting our management objectives under climate change, but these can probably be overcome by using existing management options. And so maybe just additional or enhanced efforts are necessary to counteract those key challenges or promote new opportunities. And then finally, we might decide that the feasibility of achieving our objectives, given those challenges and opportunities, is low. There's going to be more challenges than there are opportunities. We're going to need more resources and more effort. And the management options that we have available to us may not be sufficient to overcome those challenges and achieve our management objectives under climate change. So this is a time for us to pause and reflect and decide, do we change our management goals and objectives because we have low feasibility under current management? So for example, for those 3 different projects, we can think about potentially maintaining eastern box turtle habitat may be a management objective that has low feasibility because we know that it's going to be harder to maintain that habitat given drought, fluctuating water levels, and reduced winter snowpack. And there is the opportunity for management to improve habitat, but those challenges are probably going to outweigh that opportunity. So the feasibility is low. However, it's probably important for us to maintain eastern box turtle habitat for our project. So then it's up to us to decide, do we want to maintain this as a goal and objective moving forward? Or is this something we reevaluate based on our project and our management goals and objectives? For improving breeding habitat for forest interior birds, we might decide that the feasibility is high because our opportunities for active management are outweighing the potential challenges from climate change of those projected declines in conifer species. And then finally, for the urban tree canopy example, we might decide that the feasibility of achieving this objective is medium. So there are some challenges, there's also some opportunities. And so it's up to us to think about what are some of those different additional ways we can build our capacity to achieve increasing tree canopy coverage, especially in those under-canopied and under-resourced neighborhoods. So again, with this step, it's really time for us to slow down and consider whether we're going to continue with our objectives as written or if we want to adjust them. And so if you're finding that you have a management objective that has low feasibility, this is really a chance for us to consider whether you want to continue with that objective or change it. So again, really thinking about if we have that low feasibility for one of our management goals and objectives, maybe we reframe that goal or objective, or we think about different areas where we can maintain box turtle habitat and other areas where it might be a losing battle under climate change into the future. And so again, with this step, it's really a chance for us to revisit step 1, go back and make any tweaks in the adaptation workbook process that we want to for defining our goals and objectives and timeframes, and really tweaking them based on the step of evaluating our feasibility of achieving our goals and objectives under climate change. And then the online adaptation workbook will auto update your management goals and objectives if you make any changes for step 3. And so again, anything you make will be captured in that online tool. So you can go in and make those changes and they'll be reflected for the following steps moving forward through the rest of the process. And then as I mentioned, for the challenges and opportunities columns, this is really where you want to think about climate change challenges and climate change opportunities, but there is an option for including other considerations as well. And so this is where you can list any social, financial, or other factors that are also going to influence your decision to pursue your management objectives. So this is where you can really detail why you want to continue with a management objective, even though your feasibility may be low, or if feasibility is high, it's still going to be hard to achieve your goals and objectives given some capacity or funding or different social considerations. So really start to think about what are some of those different community buy-in, or maybe you have local volunteers who can help implement the project, or the project's going to be required because of a local policy from your organization, so you have to move forward with it, even if your feasibility is low and there's a lot of challenges. So this is where you can really outline some of those different details. And this is also a chance for us to think about, have you identified and connected with all affected communities or partners? So as we've thought about who are the key partners and community members who really should have a say in these projects, this is another chance to revisit some of those ideas. And we can also think about, do any of the expected climate challenges or opportunities look dramatically different through the perspectives of those partners? So for example, you might be working in the southwest part of the country, and you might be in a community where there are acequias, or those community operated watercourse or drainage ditches that are providing that water to that community. And so we know that it's going to be more challenging to continue to provide that water given drought and increased temperatures. However, that access to that water is going to be critically important for that community moving forward. And so that's just another consideration, making sure that we're thinking about the perspectives of those community members given those different climate challenges and opportunities in this step as well. And so for our 3 management objectives, we've been talking about some other considerations for eastern box turtle habitat. There might be high uncertainty about habitats will be affected. And so that's really influencing whether or not we maintain this management objective. Also, if the turtle is present, we might need to maintain habitats for as long as possible, even though there are those climate challenges presented to maintaining that habitat given drought, fluctuating water levels, and reduced winter snowpack. So this is really that place where we can provide our rationale for whether or not we're continuing with those goals and objectives. For improving breeding habitat for forest interior birds, there might be some existing funding through forest management plans to implement that active management. So we can really think about some of those other considerations and other resources that are available here. And then finally, with increasing tree canopy coverage, there's probably going to be additional community outreach needed, as well as additional time to really build that trust and relationships needed to ensure that residents really want and approve of those trees in their yards instead of street trees. So some of those different things to think about with the local community as well. So some key points on step 3. Again, this step is really to use time to ensure that you've created goals and objectives that are more likely to succeed given those projected impacts from climate change. And so your challenges and opportunities should really focus on climate change impacts, whereas your other considerations section is for those other things that are not solely related to climate change, such as policies, budgets, funding, capacity, and public engagement. And so remember, step 2, we're focusing on impacts to the site. And in this step in the adaptation workbook, we're focusing on impacts to our management goals and objectives and assessing the overall feasibility. It's also really tempting in this step to start to think about adaptation strategies, but we really want to encourage you to pause and save those ideas for step 4. So this is where we're really still documenting what are those climate challenges and climate opportunities, but then wait until step 4 to really think about some of those different adaptation actions that can help you address some of those challenges. With that, I'm going to pause and stop sharing and hand it off to Luke, who's going to provide an example.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Courtney. Yes, as Courtney mentioned, I'll be providing a specific example of a project and how that particular project used the workbook as regards step 3. And I'll take a little bit of time after that to show you how to use the mechanics of the workbook here for step 3. We'll have some time at the end for questions before we wrap up promptly at 2. Okay, sharing my screen here. And go into slideshow view. Okay, if there are comments, I will no longer see them, so go ahead and say what you really think. All right. So there are a whole range of different example projects at forestadaptation.org that you can look at and see how those projects have interacted with step 3. This particular case study comes from a project that NIAX Partners did with the Land Conservancy of West Michigan, specifically the Saul Lake Bog Nature Preserve. And in step 1, the partners from the Land Conservancy defined their overall goal as one of maintaining high-quality wetland plant communities. And underneath that broad goal, they specified 3 specific objectives. They did a great job of making numeric targets here. They were particularly interested in achieving a certain threshold level of the floristic quality index, the FQI, to 47.5 would be a pretty intact natural plant community of this bog, hardwood, swamp cover type. They specified as a second objective, limiting the abundance of exotic species, invasive plants, to less than 1% cover at the property level or the project level. And they also set an objective of expanding the prairie coverage by, on average, an acre per year. So they set themselves up for success by having 3 specific objectives that tiered to one good catch-all goal. At step 2, assessing climate change impacts, they considered both the regional climate change impacts and how those were going to be interacting with the site factors specific to their project. So one example here, generally the lake states are seeing longer periods between precipitation events in the summer, overall increase in precipitation, especially in large events. More of the precipitation comes today in large storm events than it used to. And the those changes to hydroclimate meant particular problems for the bog setting, bogs which are dependent almost exclusively on precipitation rather than groundwater inputs to their hydrology. The partners also recognized that those more frequent heavy rain events, those more frequent intense storms, would perhaps alter the way that runoff interacts with soils and surrounding land uses, potentially increasing overland flow and the contribution of drainage waters that might be bringing farm water, runoff from pesticide or fertilizer treated farm fields. Another particular climate change impact they identified was changes to plant species distributions, or perhaps the northward movement of invasive species, and how that could interact with a relatively low existing diversity of native prairie species in the prairie cover type. And the final climate change impact they identified for this project area was that existing invasive species and insects will likely become worse. It's not just a matter of new species becoming adventive in the area and creating problems, but it's the existing ones becoming worse, whether due to longer growing seasons or decreased host diversity, any number of possible mechanisms. So an excellent job here of filtering regional climate impacts through site-specific factors, where they then got on to step 3. And here, this slide really takes the challenges and opportunities at a high level. I'll show you how in the workbook, your challenges and opportunities are iterative. There is a pair, both of those things exist for each of the objectives you identify. This example, I'm going to talk at a high level about the overall project challenges and opportunities. The challenges they identified were particularly those longer dry periods during the summertime, affecting the performance of sphagnum mosses found in the bog. Changes in runoff, with those changes to how water moves across the landscape, there's the potential that more runoff could affect acidity, which is typically high, and nutrient content, which is typically low in bog environments, bogs which tend to be hydrologically and biogeochemically isolated from their surrounding landscapes, that with that climate change, with those larger storms, there could be changes to the, let's say, the biogeochemical characteristics of the bog that make it harder to actually keep the bog a bog. On the flip side of the coin, those during the longer dry intervals between precipitation events, that could make it harder to get permits to do burning. This is a matrix of ecosystem types where the quality of the prairie, floristically speaking, is much affected by the ability to burn it most every year. being able to do prescribed burning under safe conditions is complicated by longer dry periods. It's also complicated by really wet years. There are also that hydroclimatic variability might also mean that you just don't get a burn window at a time when you might have in the past, because fuels never really dry out. And a fourth challenge that they identified at the whole project level related to climate change was that the increase in drought conditions would potentially have the effect of increasing spotted knapweed invasion. Spotted knapweed, which is a semi-parasitic plant that steals nutrients from the roots of especially grasses, prairie grasses, and of course really vigorously competes for cover as well, limits the ability of more conservatively growing native grassland species to remain present within these prairie communities. So these are 4 challenges that they identified as a result of climate change regionally and as filtered through the lens of the project area. On the flip side, they identified some potentially good news, one of which is the possibility that southern species of wetland affinities, including southern bog species, could expand northwards into the area, and that could help to offset the loss, perhaps, of more northward distributed species. Bogs, as a post-glacial relic, they're kind of at the southern end of their distribution in southwest lower Michigan, but there are plenty of acid wetlands to the south throughout the country that could provide germplasm and species that might be happy to move north with a warming climate. And of course, let's not forget that 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, prairies had some banner millennia in the Midwest during the Prairie Peninsula expansion, hotter, drier climate conditions during the hypsothermal interval, the xerothermic period. We know that prairies do well under those hot, dry conditions, and that it could actually be good for prairie plant communities now that we're looking at longer, hotter stretches of weather during the summertime. And in light of these challenges and opportunities, the project team assessed an overall feasibility level of medium for their collective goal and their objectives. What they chose to do about that in step 4, the part that we'll be going over in 2 weeks when we reconvene, what they chose to do about that, well, if we know that there are going to be hydrologic and biogeochemical changes to these isolated bog depressions in landscapes where many people are doing many different things with the land, that would argue for acquiring adjacent properties, thinking of this nature preserve as maybe a core of high quality plant communities, but then buffering that with perhaps less high quality ecosystems, quality in a floristic sense, but those might be ecosystems that could do a valuable service towards intercepting runoff, slowing that flow down, immobilizing nutrients contained in the runoff, and that through the ability to control what goes on lands surrounding the nature preserve, it might be possible to maintain the hydrologic conditions of the bogs, even though there are more heavy precipitation events coming with climate change. One adaptation tactic identified as a result of considering those challenges and opportunities was enhancing the wetness of existing wet places, swales. Shallow excavation might be a rather engineering-focused way to maintain hydrology through dry periods. That's one possibility. Invasive species, of course, the bane of many a prairie nature preserve manager, but you know, people are often happy to help out if you provide them an opportunity and a target. Folks are glad to pull knapweed or participate in activities that allow for some feeling of participation in conserving a place. So the team identified increasing volunteer opportunities to help with the management of invasives and also monitoring the invasives. Photography, digital photography, citizen science apps on smartphones, and so on. And just bringing it home, since we're talking about a 5-step process here with the workbook, monitoring, that's a topic that Adrian Keller and I will be presenting on in a few weeks as part of the training. The project team identified a number of feasible variables to monitor over time so that they can assess, hey, are the actions that we chose to take having their desired outcomes? And one of those, which is probably the easiest to monitor, is just water level. There are a whole host of examples of community science, water level monitoring, stream staff gauges in many different parts of the country. Take a picture of the staff gauge with your phone and send it to this phone number. And there you have data, the ability to construct time series of water levels before and after precipitation events, for example. And as relates to any actions that the team chooses to take, such as acquiring adjacent lands for hydrologic buffering. Water quality, measuring the concentrations of nutrient ions in the water that is reaching the wetlands or in the waters of the wetlands themselves. pH, of course, very important. The high acidity of bogs is part of what makes them what they are and what causes them to hold so many delightful plant species that have evolved under low nutrient conditions. Plant diversity and composition are relatively straightforward to monitor. People with eyes, people with drones with eyes. These are ways that you can get a handle on changes over time in the plant communities and whether those are responding to any of the other adaptation actions, more or less burning, for example. And then while they're at it, monitoring plant diversity and community composition, tracking the percent cover of invasive species was a 4th monitoring variable that the project team proposed to collect in order to track and learn. And of course, feedback around that 5-step adaptive monitoring, adaptive management process to learn as they go and decide if they need to make corrections, of course. All right, here's a chance for questions, overall questions of Courtney or me about the process, about the concepts, before we move into the next part, which is focused on how to use the workbook. Any questions? Anything pop up in the chat that I missed? Cool. All right. Well, we'll have more time at the end as well for questions. All right. Next up. All right. Just an overview of how you do step 3 using the workbook. Every objective that you created in your first step is going to appear in the workbook interface in step 3. So think about the implications of that. If you got objective crazy back in step 1, you're going to be having to revisit a lot of things right now. I'm not going to advise what to do, but one thing that people often seem to do is focus on a subset of their objectives. Think back to our step 1 lecture, 3 to 5 objectives tends to be a manageable number for most projects. You can always expand upon this later, but for now, I just want to mention that. You'll have the chance to explicitly identify challenges and opportunities for each objective. That's different than what I just talked about, which was kind of holistic at the project level. I urge you to use the interface to add each challenge and opportunity individually. If you're adding one challenge that is a sentence that actually contains 3 different challenges, you're not using it right. An important part of using the workbook is to be explicit and to really parse out individual thoughts that you're having. And as you go, if you realize you need to reconsider those objectives, you can go back to step 1 of the workbook, and it's smart enough to save your changes for you. I'll point out that in the newsletter that Danielle sends out, there will be links to a tutorial PDF There are also recorded videos of how to do this. There are a lot of ways to find help using already existing resources about the workbook as you go. All right, so here's what the screen looks like. I have pulled up the Adaptive Aspen Management Experiment. That was my first taste of the adaptation workbook process about 5 years ago. This was a project that Stephen Handler helped us put together at the U of M BioStation. A couple of our participants on this training, Adam Schubel and Jason Talent, have been involved in this project. So what you see here is the dashboard. Notice on the left, I've never used, how do I get a laser pointer? Is that annotate?
Not sure, it could be an annotate, yeah.
Okay, can folks see my mouse moving?
We can.
Was that a you can?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, that's good enough. Notice that in this particular project, one of the initial management topics we selected was the aspen birch cover type. And then we also chose to add some specific goals and objectives related to carbon management. So that's going to have implications for you if you have multiple management topics at the outset. First, I'm going to show you how to enter challenges and opportunities for your objectives related to that cover type. So over here on this side of the dashboard, you've got your drop down where you can quickly review regional climate impacts by clicking this pop out arrow if you have forgotten what those are or want to consult them. And then this pop out right here is where we see our goals and objectives related to the aspen birch cover type. In this particular project, we had as our first goal to increase the age class, structural, and compositional diversity of the whole management area. This was an area of very homogeneous, old age, big tooth aspen. And we wanted to accomplish that goal through the specific objective of removing the dominant mature aspens from 4 management units. We delineated the whole project area of something like, I don't know, a few hundred acres into about 18 management units, and we slated 4 of those for treatment. We had another goal here, just for the purpose of demonstration, one of our other goals was to increase, yes, this points out how when you have multiple objectives underneath the same goal, you'll see the goal listed twice, and then a different objective listed under it the second time. So our second objective under this broad goal of increasing age class, structural, and compositional diversity, our second objective was to consider harvesting additional units in the future to introduce further age class, structural, and compositional diversity. And here's where you can add particular specific challenges. You can add as many as you would like on the Add a Challenge button. We identified for this goal, if we're talking about doing additional harvests in future years, then we have to recognize that the likelihood of extreme events damaging the existing forest, that likelihood is only going to increase with time. So it may become more challenging to conduct future harvests in an economically viable way due to the probability of extreme storms coming in and blowing over large areas of these very large trees. At the same time, we recognized an opportunity related to climate change under this objective. If we're talking about harvesting additional units in future years, well, there were about a half a dozen management units in this area that were cut about 35 years ago. It's a very productive site. And with the longer growing seasons and the increased precipitation, it might be that we're looking at potentially shorter rotations. It might be actually feasible to do harvesting sooner than we think because of more favorable growing conditions, more rapid regrowth of those 30 to 40-year-old stands. And we also identified specifically a recently opened plywood mill about 75 miles away that might increase the demand for what would typically have been sub-merchantable timber. And considering these challenges and opportunities, we assessed an overall feasibility of medium. Courtney mentioned not to let our views get clouded here by things beyond our control, although we did recognize 4 or 5 years ago when putting this together that at the time we had a lot of administrative support for and scientific capacity to study this project. So we had good, this is an important consideration in a university environment, really any organization where you have people changing over time, that often will become a consideration that might lead you to, say, a score of high feasibility for adaptation actions taken now, but medium or low feasibility for adaptation actions that you're considering taking in the future. And overall, we assess that to be a medium level of feasibility for our objectives related to harvesting in order to increase age class structural and compositional diversity. And then just going here, showing you the adaptation workbook interface, we move through the goals and objectives related to the aspen birch cover type, and then we can get specific into goals and objectives related to other management topics. We found that this carbon management was not initially part of our goals or objectives for this project. It was entirely in terms of adaptation when we set this up 4 or 5 years ago. But subsequently, and indeed as part of a previous online training that we did, we were able to go back through and add carbon goals and objectives. This is a good example of how we can use the workbook in an iterative way. You don't have to do it all the first time. You can go back to this framework of your project and add goals and objectives related to another target of your management, in this case, carbon management. And I won't belabor these points, but I'll have them here in case there's questions about that. The next things I'd like to say relate to some housekeeping. Now's your time to finish up any items from step 2, assessing your climate vulnerabilities. This is the week to work on your evaluating your management objectives. Step 3, there is a homework for this. I think every group has probably been contacted by a person from NIACS at this point of view. We have tried to schedule with you a short check-in just to find out how you're doing, whether that's with how you're conceiving of your project, how you're interfacing with the workbook, and so on. There will be a video that you can view from the email that Danielle will send as a follow-up. And pointing out some next items, we have discussions this week. I know that Stephen and I do a Tuesday morning one, so a bunch of you should have on your calendars your respective discussion sections. Bring along your step 2 and step 3 topics for discussion. Be prepared to talk about the climate impacts that you think are most relevant to your project, to your area. There will be time in this discussion section this week to talk about how regional climate impacts filter through your site conditions and your context. And there will be time to talk about the feasibility of your management goals and objectives in light of climate change. Last thing I will say is we do not have class next week. Next week is break week. So after our discussions this week, our next meeting will be Monday, April 17th. Oddly enough, Monday at April 17th, we will first have a special session at 11 a.m. Eastern on Monday the 17th. That's a time for folks to come join us for a sort of a menu jam. We're going to have people from NIACS being point of contact for a whole bunch of the different menus that we have available for use in this process. And then following that menu special session will be lecture on Monday the 17th at the normal scheduled time. So that's what I've got. Any questions? Alan, I see your hand, your real hand, not even a digital hand. What's up?
I have two questions. Being older, I tend to be print on paper bias. And I was wondering if there's any way to print out what we have in the workbook digitally. In other words, part of it's a long-term consideration. If we go back a year from now and want to visit our stuff, will it be still on the platform? So that's one of my questions. Is there any way to print it out? My other question has to do with citations. When I first went through step 2, I noticed there was a little symbol where I was asked to cite where I was getting my information from. Most of my sources were print sources, not digital. And it seemed that icon wanted links to digital sources, and I didn't know how to do it. So I reached out to Samantha at UVM, and she responded on how she looked up my print sources online. But when I went back to put them in there, I no longer had access or couldn't find the icon that allowed me to record my citation.
Okay, yeah. You know, I could answer some of your questions, but I can see the true master of the adaptation workbook has been nodding the whole time. So Danielle, do you want to step in and throw us a line?
First thing, you did the right thing, which is reach out to us. So I'm glad Sam was able to answer some of your questions. What we can do is we can help to transpose some of those links into your workbook. So don't worry about that. Next, regarding your plan, just so that everyone is aware, at any time you can export your adaptation plan. So when you're in the adaptation workbook, there's that gray bar on the left. Maybe Luke, you can go back to one of your screenshots. Thanks. And Luke will hover all the way on the left at the very bottom. There's a little thing that says export and share plan. And if you click it at any time, even before you've put in your goals and objectives, you'll see how that plan is being generated and all of your info is being plugged into these pre-formulated, pre-formatted tables. So I would definitely suggest, Alan, even after each use, after each time you've gone in there, just go to that, press print, and you should be allowed to print to PDF, which would save it to your computer so you don't have to waste the computer paper, but you'll at least have that running copy saved just in case anything happens. We've never had a plan disappear. And we have people, they've been using the adaptation workbook since it's been live since like 2015, I think, or 2016, whenever it's been live, and their stuff is still there. So we have no plans to depreciate projects. So you can come back years from now and it should be there. But it's just a good, best practice to save a copy locally so you have it at your disposal. But we can walk you through that in a one-on-one. Sam and I can get together and show you our screen, or even get you a copy of your own project and email it to you if that's easier.
Thank you.